This is Duke University.
Within the sanctuaries, have you ever felt like that there was something going on in that area you didn't know, the deep sea area, defined as the depth below which you don't know what's going on, that really affected the way you managed the area that you did know?
The only thing I can really think of are Navy operations, where they will install things and conduct things without our knowledge, actually. Or when we become aware of it, we'll never be able to know what they actually did. Aside from that, there isn't a great deal of covert operations, of things we don't know about.
Well, I'm not thinking of covert operations as much as just processes.
Oh, there's tons of that stuff, of course.
And degradation. And we have 100 or more years of deep sea degradation, dropping nuclear wastes and ships and all sorts of things that we've done to the deep sea.
Well, dump sites, ocean dumping is a good one. I mean, that was something that is now outlawed in the U.S. But that was a very tractable one because it was place specific. So if something is place specific and activity specific, you can do that kind of an analytic approach. But if it's generic, it's very hard. Now, I was very interested to hear about these large plumes that you were describing. That's a very tractable analytic problem for that, particularly if they're in domains where there are certain primary productivity concentrations, let's say. We're always learning more about that. But when you go deep, we say deep, dark, and dangerous, but it's also deep, dark, and I don't know. We just have a big lack of knowledge about some of these things. So when you have that, we would call that decision-making under uncertainty. So when you have decision-making under uncertainty, it conditions characteristics of your decisions. They cannot be irreversible. They have to have a rigorous observation or monitoring loop and a feedback. They have to have a sunset. So those decisions that you make under uncertainty, there are other characteristics, have to have certain properties. Otherwise, they're not sound choices. Deep ocean, we have great uncertainty, actually. Not equally everywhere, and uncertainty is only valued the most where you have the highest connection. So even in that context, it always comes down to the facts of the case of connection in time and place. Deep oceans change slowly. The rapid changes we're seeing are not in the deep ocean. The organisms in the deep ocean change and grow slowly. Not the case up on the shelf.
Well, I think we don't know. We assume that, and we know that places where you have very short-lived hydrothermal events, organisms may grow slowly, but ecosystems change very rapidly. Colonization, death. But also think of it, there's this decision-making under uncertainty, but there's also the shifting baselines problem, which is, I think of the Channel Islands Marine Sanctuary and all the waste, military waste that's on the bottom there. And you manage that sanctuary basically, having inherited a lot of that. So we don't know what the baseline really was.
That's a very good point. The shifting baselines is something that is inevitable for us. Every generation will find a new baseline. And when you've been doing this a long time, as some of the graveyards in the audience have, which should be written, I guess, you begin to see we often sort of lose track of that. It's a dodge. And I always use the Florida Keys example because people can go there. So if you go to the Florida Keys 30 years ago, and you go today, you notice a dramatic change. However, if you didn't go 30 years ago and you went today, I think it was pristine. And your view of a pristine world is that view, which we know is not really a system that's healthy, nor going necessarily in the right direction. But we always will kid ourselves about it because we'll plan for the plan for the status quo, which is the shifted baseline already. And then we'll work towards sustaining that which you never can, right? And then in another decade or so, we'll do it again, and we'll start from a different point. Usually not up here, it's usually down here. It's a conundrum that we have. And I've observed it to be almost a decadal cycle. It's like I think a decade is like some kind of special mathematical number for us. It's like Avogadro's number or something, like a base number. A decade is the times in which we reevaluate stuff, or the time in which we are willing to make a conclusion. For some reason, a decade sticks out for us. And that's when we also allow that shifting baseline mentality to work. I've been observing this for about the last 5 years, and every time I look at these situations, it's always been 10 years. Why is that? There's something in that decadal stuff. Public policy as well.
Zero is the magic number. Panel, do you have any questions for each other before we open it up to the audience? You were going to say
Well, I
something.
do have one thing to say, Dan. I mean, I guess it depends, what is your definition of deep sea? I mean, you know, there's not a, unless I'm not aware of it, I don't know the definition from a legal perspective in the United States. I mean, is there one?
Specific to the topic. Like, clearly there is one in the deep sea that everybody's familiar with. So it's only with respect to that piece.
Right.
Speak up, dear.
What is it?
Well, it's the area right beyond national jurisdiction, beyond the continental shelf. So
Which is
that's
high
considered-
seas.
Well, that's the water column. So
But see, for me, that's not, I think of deep sea is, it can be where the ocean gets, yeah,
Say again?
foot of the slope.
Tell us who you are.
Lee Kimball, I've done a lot of work on international ocean law over the years, but now retired. But I was just, that was a point I was going to come to, that the panel has covered a range of topics from different perspectives, but I, you know, to think about it, if the point is how you manage the deep sea sustainably, then you need to look at the legal jurisdiction to know who's responsible, in fact, for that management. And so then you, as you said, I mean, then you're at the beyond national jurisdiction, beyond continental shelf, or the area as defined by the international mechanism. And then that, to me, that's the only point at which you can, there are deep seas, both within national jurisdiction and beyond national jurisdiction. But the mechanism for providing for that sustainability is different. It's the U.S. government with some caveats and water column within national jurisdiction. And of course, it's the international, we have a joint and specifically with which we keep in mind international sea level.
And that's why I usually think high seas versus deep seas, because we have deep sea mining that's proposed in the EEZ of Papua New Guinea, deep sea mining that's proposed in the EEZ of Fiji.
Yeah, I mean, deep sea is both within and beyond
That's
national
right.
jurisdiction. It's really what's the problem you're trying to address, and then what's the correct mechanism for addressing it.
That's right. And it's, how you define it depends on whether you're looking at it from a legal perspective or an ecological connectivity perspective, or a scientific coverage. What don't you know? Craig,
So if I could just say, so that was sort of my question to everybody, but building on that is, you know, I think that we need to understand, so I'm going to differ from Dan a little here. I think for, as you pointed out, corals, fisheries, and the upwellings and how marine mammals, get their food and from the upwelling productivity, I think we do need to understand areas that we may not be actually able to go out to. And I think modeling, and particularly a lot of the integrated fisheries models that we're coming up with of late, where you can get a temperature and a size of the sand and the slope and where it is in the water column. And if you can sort of identify that species, you can then, what exists there, you can do modeling in areas that are similar that you may not be able to get to, that can give you sort of a sense of, that's probably not the most important priority area that needs to be addressed. But my guess is, from what I know, there's probably corals over there, or there's probably important fish habitat over there. So I think sort of our technological advancements in modeling and pulling together the information we do know, when we do know it, transporting that to other areas is something that can help us as we move along.
And we do that with deep sea mapping now, right? If we know what the bottom looks like, we guess it's growing there.
This is habitat suitability modeling. We all do that all the time, actually.
But it's getting better and better.
But
right?
in order to do it in the deep sea, you have to have the data sets actually. So you need to know about the life utilization strategy of the animal. You need to know about your affinity to specific types of bottom, grain sizes, temperatures, light. You need to know all those things first before you can make your model to then project to areas where you don't have it. And my point is that in the deep ocean, we don't have the basics to actually do enough of that to take advantage of the idea of habitat suitability modeling.
And the models don't help you track how it changes.
And they're yesterday's news.
So, well, Craig and then.
Can I defer to Christina?
Sure.
She seemed,
Go ahead.
you're on point with this
Okay,
conversation.
yeah.
I want to interrupt.
Well, my husband's a businessman. He invests in renewable energy resources, and he tries to do due diligence before he invests in any new companies. It's our money he's investing. He wants to know what can possibly go wrong before investing in anything. He wants to know what are the weaknesses of this plan. And then what he'll say is, you go ahead and you invest, and it'll be something that you completely unexpect. You don't expect that will wipe you out. Somebody decides to take a loan from a bank that then collapses, and the whole thing collapses. So I think part of our job is to narrow that window of what we don't know, because we are learning about tipping points, we are learning about cumulative impact, we are learning about the pollutants that concentrate in the deep sea species that then we're catching and feeding to our children. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of new science that has come out that is telling us that we do need a longer term perspective, that we need to be understanding that there are huge connections between the shallow sunlit zone and the deep sea from the larvae that spend their time in both. And if you are interested in trying to maintain some of your fisheries, swordfish spend most of their time down at 600 meters. Elephant seals similarly spend 75% of their time in the high seas. There is this, as the Census Marine Life showed us, that there's huge amount of interconnections, and maybe we haven't done a good enough job of advertising that. Maybe it's more of a PR campaign, because once you do start to realize the value of seismic indicators that tell you when you've got a slip, undersea slip, it's going to cause tsunamis up in Sri Lanka. I mean, we do need to start getting our feelers out there. And in terms of, I loved your idea about sort of no regrets, and you need to be able to plan and make sure that industry is incorporating the cost of caution into its activities. But I think that there's also no regrets plan that you can do in terms of planning real conservation initiatives proactively. Then it really becomes a win-win situation.
And both of you are saying you can make decisions under uncertainty. It's not enough just to say that was a black swan. It was not our responsibility to keep that in mind.
Thank you. I want to go back to challenge my friend Dan on his assertion about where you'd spend that next $5 in your pocket. And I think if I were tempted to just look for the known connectivities and then make reinvestments in those, I'm probably trapping myself in the program manager mindset of I've got a limited budget rather than how could I direct society's attention. Because if I had a limited budget and I really wanted to do best for the coastal residents of at least our nation, I would go right with what you're saying. But then I look at where the space program is, where we're spending very large dollars on, I don't even know if we know what the impact is on us, never mind a slow turnaround, as you were analogizing to the deep sea. So I think if I were looking at a finite set of resources that I had to bring wellness to the American people, then I would be tempted to go where we already have solved the science questions, at least to know the cause and effects and the relative connectedness. But the fact that we have people in this room and beyond who are engaging in business propositions that warrant a better awareness of what the deep sea might be, I think it is a worthy investment, and I'll put my $5 on it.
$300 million is good.
And
And that's,
Just
that
get all
$300 million
trained.
is not just oceans, that's for everything.
I go back to what Sally was saying about where people live and what value comes to economies. I mean, one of the issues that we have in dealing with how do we help move forward in the world we live in is the paradigm we think is the way the world works. And we have a very top-down view of that. In the United States, and I'm so proud of our country, in the 1970s, this country passed more environmental legislation and made more investments in environment and natural resource than any place on earth ever in the history of mankind. Look at every piece of environmental legislation, and you'll see mostly it was passed in the decade of the 70s, actually.
It was president.
Who was president?
Nixon.
But it wasn't about Mr. Nixon. It was about a societal dimension of demanding some action. It was about Americans viewing themselves as poisoning themselves, about a system out of control. And it's manifested itself in the greatest body ever of organized thinking and, quote, governance for this problem for decades. But let's take that apart for a moment. That decade and those dimensions of governance were designed by and passed by a generation that was out of an experience which is called the Second World War, which is a large bureaucratic, big systems work. And they create, I was there as well, they created a very big government answer to our problems. It was a big government answer. And we created new big government entities. And we pushed things into big government answers. We were very comfortable with that because we had just proven how that works. We had won a great war, we had built this great economy, we had been these great organizations, we were all part of it, and consequently we created things in the image of our success. And we created a very top-down, organized, and disconnected, if you will, body of work called our environmental legislation. Now here we are, decades later, and the question is, does it really work that way? And if I have $5 to spend, what do I do with it? Do I put it into that all-knowing data and views from the top are going to really solve the answers that we find ourselves perplexed about our shifting baseline? Or do maybe I rethink that a little bit? So if you give me $5 to spend, I'm putting the $5 into community programming. I'm putting it into communities that are those economies along the coast. And I want to change the way, in fact, those decisions get made. Therein lies something why we cannot resolve this problem. The overcomplexity, the confusion between all of these pieces of legislation. Try and do this. Get out of the ocean, go on in a watershed and try to make choices. You can't. The law says you can't. It's got to be that way. That's what Clean Water Act says. Oh, and the Clean Air Act says that, and I can't make that choice. Oh, and RCRA says that, you can't make that choice. We have created some internal conflicting structures. So we can't, as good thinkers, look at a system and say, well, let's figure out the best way to do this.
So you'll never invest in
We got a conundrum.
because there's no community.
Sorry.
So let's turn it up to the audience. Do you have any questions? Caroline?
You actually took my question. I was going to ask.
Tell us who you are.
Oh, I'm Caroline Coogan from the Ocean Foundation. And I was going to ask actually about investing that $5. I kind of have to, decision making in uncertainty. I was just at the Economics of the Ocean conference, and there was a neat story about if you're out picking mushrooms and looking for a mushroom, and you find a fruiting body that you don't know, are you going to pick it up and eat it? And overwhelmingly, everyone says no, of course not. And so I think there's an argument to be made that says, you know, if you don't know what the connections are between the deep sea, there obviously are some, and we're learning about them all the time, but you'll never know what they are until you learn about them first. And so just use your own argument to say you should study them and you should invest your money in the future. And this might actually be an exciting opportunity to, instead of going back, and we're constantly looking back and seeing at what we've done wrong and trying to fix our problems to instead get ahead of it for once. And
Yeah.
maybe it's actually an opportunity to get ahead instead of always catching up.
It's a good comment, but it also makes me think too that, it's not just where you spend $5, but whose $5 you spend. So there are certainly places on the planet that are clearly public goods, public resources. And there are other places that are more private or community oriented. So if you think about where you'd spend your money in the community, I think first I want the community to spend money in its own ecosystems that it benefits from directly. And you talk about big government. We see this with, for instance, the way we manage waterways. These local communities in North Carolina will sit around with the waterway filling up with sediments and keep stamping their feet saying, when is the Army Corps going to come and dredge this thing, right? When they could certainly do it. So when you think about restoring coastal areas, this is clearly one of these places where it's a good investment for community dollars. If you think about the deep sea and who holds that in trust, we'll never invest that $5 if it really is made on sort of a community basis or even that private dollar. But it is a public resource, and so you have to think about that maybe a different pot of money that comes from.
I'd like to hear from some people in the room. I think we have a lot of interesting talents and experience in the room. So if people could maybe introduce themselves. And
Yeah, I'm John Opperman from Odyssey Marine Exploration, and we've made a business out of shipwreck exploration, but also been also trying to get into the ocean mining world in terms of phosphate, SMS, and polymetallic sulfides, and so on. And I've heard a lot of discussion on the panel from spurring incentives from U.S. companies, and how do you do that? What are some of the things in there that I've got the $5 to spend, and it's Odyssey Marine Exploration's money? How do I spend that money? Where's the best investment for my shareholders in partnering with the United States or partnering with another government? Right now, we currently have to go in the ocean world. We have to go to another government because we have to partner with that government to harvest the polymetallic nodules. How do we do that with the United States government? What spurs the $5 coming out of Odyssey's wallet, so to speak? How do we do that? Not directed at anybody, but all of the panel members.
I'll take a stab. You go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, having just gone to a meeting in London with people from the environmental resource monitoring field, I would say observational technologies that will allow you to figure out what is an impact, what is not, what is normal, what is going on, because this will be required under the Law of the Sea Convention in order to determine compliance with the requirements that will be put in place for exploitation. And that is still the critical missing link. So a lot of those technologies, the service sector that is evolving around wants to figure out how to get the stuff up to 4,000 meters from the seabed will be, how do you make this happen and how do you make sure it is happening in the right way? But actually, if you have technologies on how to lift large ships and pieces of wreck up to the seabed, how do you do it with losing the least amount?
We can do that.
Craig, you want to say?
What concerns me is I look at the invitation of other countries of their national investments in technology to bring rare earths up from the seabed. I'm not sure that I would recommend that the United States spend federal money to develop that technology because I think the strength of America is private sector investment, et cetera. And that's a personal opinion, but I think that the history of the U.S. has proven that. But I would take the $5, John, jump in a taxi cab, and go down to Capitol Hill and ask people there why not signing Law of the Sea requires you to invest in a foreign economy rather than continue to generate job growth in the United States. Now, that's probably beyond my expertise to render such an opinion or my portfolio, but I think that would be a good investment of your $5.
Yep.
So I'm going to just use the example I used earlier about the kind of work that we're engaged with oil and gas companies in the Arctic. So, there's a pooling of resources when you don't have the resources to go and you have this urgent need like we do in the Arctic, for example, where BOEM, Shell, Coast Guard, and us we have figured out a way to pool resources to get to, to try to learn more, do more research on our ecosystems and affected activities. And we're able to separate that from the actual permit. And so I think there's a real value in us figuring out ways where entities want permits and we don't have all the funds to do the research necessary to know is this a good thing or a bad thing, to figure out a way to pool resources so that research can be done there. But it's not like a quid pro quo, but it's we've been talking about this a little bit recently. And I don't know, how do you think companies would feel about that?
Well, I think it's an interesting concept. I mean, we certainly, to Dan's point, we certainly want to be environmental stewards of the,
Right.
And anything that we do, we certainly want to be environmental stewards. And to Greg's point, we certainly, as a result of our missions in either shipwreck or minerals, I mean, we come back with a load full of data that anybody at NOAA would drool over. That, that we could possibly give you and offer you as a side benefit to our cruises. So I think we can I think companies like ours fill a lot of niches for you.
Can I just take one more? So I'm just going to build on that one, so with renewable or oil and gas, one step further. I mean, for example, as offshore wind becomes more of a reality, the wind assets, the wind resources are really valuable for our ability to predict the weather and to put into our weather models. But there's some reluctance, a little bit. They think it's proprietary. Some are willing to give it to us, some think it's proprietary information. But we're able, in a modeling sense, to sort of mask it when it gets jumbled in with all sorts of other data points. So that's another issue that, so do you think companies are would be more willing to provide that if it could be masked as to its?
I think.
I think that's a route we really have to go on.
That tenure issue, one of you brought it up earlier. If it was Christina, the Odyssey applies to a certain kind of tenure. You don't have that with shipwrecks.
Right. You don't have
Right.
it.
So it's
Highly uncertain.
Craig and Dan.
Our deep sea community, science community, has had experience with at least one company, Odyssey,
Right.
in teaming up with federal and academic scientists, both along with the private sector science inquiry, because we're both trying to find out the same information about the site. The downstream effect of that knowledge may be different in terms of the business model versus a scientific report, but we have done so in the past. And something else that we're very energetic at pursuing now in the National Ocean Partnership Program is finding industry components that are willing to offer either capacity or knowledge or equipment, but to team up with industry where we can, particularly in the deep sea, because there just isn't that much attention going on. And we have operators like Odyssey and others who are focused in that operating area that really helps our science programs that are interested in those same areas. So I think there's opportunity for us to pursue that discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Reagan administration handled these kinds of things in a certain way. Because industry wanted to know where to go. Where do we go? And the Reagan administration reversed that and said, well, our job is not to provide you detailed granularity of data everywhere for wherever you might go. What our job is to tell you in a larger, sort of higher altitude sense where not to go. And then to provide what do we need from you if you choose to go somewhere. Because all of your choices in your company are about your bottom line. They're about your financial picture, your location theories, all yourself. Government cannot be part of that. We can never possibly do that. So there is a generic survey level so that you don't prospect indiscriminately forever. But when it comes to actually conducting the activity, or the detailed data, that's your job. Now, I would submit that you got to look at the OCS program that Paul has. We tend not to want to look at that sometimes. They do a very good job in the logic of how that works. The government provides you with a spatial domain, police areas. It also provides you with a rough estimate of potential before you even begin. And then you use your own energies to decide if you actually want to bid for that. So you have to do a little
You homework want to play in
yourself.
that space.
And then if in fact you get that, then you still have to do a DEIS and all of the NEPA requirements. before you conduct your activity. I think it's a good way to go, actually.
And increasingly, you're going to have to demonstrate that the area that you're likely to affect is relatively biologically pauper, compared to all the other areas around it. So you're going to have to demonstrate pretty clearly what's around there. And then if people like Christina have her way, you're going to have to sort of propose a set-aside area too that's representative or better. So you're going to have to explore those areas. And the ISA is going to take you $5 anyhow. So
They are, or $250 of it.
that's right.
I wanted to
Tell us who you are.
Sorry, Harlan Cohen, IEC, and I wanted to I guess comment on a remark that was made in passing about marine scientific research and the lack of oversight thereof. That is how it was done. Just to say that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea does have a part that addresses marine scientific research. I don't have it here with me, but there are provisions with respect of within national jurisdiction and beyond. And certainly one of the provisions assumes that information will be exchanged amongst parties and made publicly available. So I think one could argue, many do not actually, of course, implement this, that there is an obligation when you do marine scientific research in areas beyond national jurisdiction to share, publish the information that comes from that, and that would be a common good as well, because then others could build on that knowledge. And let us also hope that the regular process, the global ocean assessment, we call it that, will bring some of these data and information together by 2014 in a way that will be useful for knowledge, for planning, and for management of the oceans, both within and beyond national jurisdiction. But I do think we should be looking at an assumption that information from marine scientific research should be public.
Ben Shelf with the Ocean Foundation. When we're talking about the high seas, in a lot of ways, some of the issues that come up parallel, the debate around climate change. We're talking about extra-national spaces, which no one has direct jurisdiction over necessarily, but in some way are connected to all of us. And like climate change, I think the key is to develop the knowledge to start to value some of these ecosystem services these benthic ecosystems provide for us. But rather than looking at their ability to sequester carbon, like a red or a blue carbon scheme, look at how these ecosystems contribute to overall ocean productivity. How do we do this research? How do we conduct it? Where do we find the resources? Obviously, I think public-private partnerships are key. But the question is, how do we structure those relationships in such a way where private companies don't feel like their information, their trade secrets are being compromised by doing some type of knowledge sharing or knowledge gathering? So do you guys have any kind of approach to protect that information, but at the same time use it in a way that scientists can look at these data sets and draw conclusions and develop models based off of information that is essentially proprietary and private?
My experience is that proprietary information remains private. This is the way it's been.
There's the question, though, of who defines proprietary and who has that function. Because the International Seabed Authority, the contractors, have an obligation to share information, but they can retain the proprietary information. But it turns out that they have been retaining so much information that they're no longer able to share the sort of environmental information that they have to. But I think you have in a lot of legislation that there's a respect for proprietary information, but there does need to be a judgment call as to what truly is of strict commercial value and what can be released.
That's right. And I think that when you think about proprietary, you have to think about who owns the resource. Are you leasing the resource, which you are? So it's a public trust resource. And then what is the economic cost to the firm of releasing proprietary information? So we tend to think about fisheries law, and you have to hold that information very close, because if you don't, anyone else can come right up beside you and catch that same fish. And if you've seen sort of purse seine fishing, that's what people will do. They'll just get right inside and get your boat inside the other boat's seine, because you can see it. So when you think about the proprietary risks of revealing, you have minerals here. You do have some certain degree of tenure in the current system, but what you don't have, you get this big 100,000 square lease to explore, then you have rights to 15% of it. Well, 85% goes back on the market, goes back on the block essentially, and you don't have first dibs on that. The other thing to think about too, when we think about your question, is that we can learn a lot from the Endangered Species Act, which has led people to do things like cut down all the trees before they find the red-legged frog here. Right? And so we have to create incentives so we don't get into that same kind of dilemma with these deep-sea industries who, in many cases, in all those crime cases, have really opened our eyes to what's down there. We don't want them to stop sharing that information because they feel that we're going to use it against them somehow.
In proprietary data sets that oil companies, for example, can continue to extract wealth from the data set once they acquire it themselves, they have been largely free in sharing that as long as the full value of the information is not extracted and frustrates the purpose of their further marketing. So we have found in the science community very good targets to go and look at because of the high resolution surveys that the oil companies have undertaken. And we can go back with even higher resolution that's not worth the oil companies' value, but for scientific purposes, extract more information. That has worked collaboratively. We've tried to go the next step, and actually in the Marine Sanctuaries Act and also in the Ocean Exploration Act, there's an opportunity for any party to donate to the government data sets. And what tax consequences may exist from that donation are independent of the recipient other than potentially valuing that data. That comes into play when we start looking at buying data from a provider. The reality would be if a provider wants to sell us data, once we accept it and use public money, it's now public data, and no longer is there an opportunity to continue a market stream for whatever those data may have been that were bought. Open question in terms of the tax consequences, but it would likely be the very same thing. I don't know if we've had that experience yet. But we have had success in looking at proprietary data sets, largely because the purpose we're applying those data for is different from what the commercial purpose was that the original investor made the investment.
There's a lot of ways to be creative. But the EU, when they fund a science project, the data becomes public 6 months after the money ends. You have no choice, but they do have to deal with the minimum. When they start to engage in more commercial cross-partnerships, they do have to deal with that issue.
I think we're much more likely to get from industry, the value of information rather than just a cash handout.
Yeah.
Before we leave that subject, I think that's a very fertile subject, and in minds other than the science community, perhaps economists and business minds helping the science community might be able to figure out more creative pathways down that corridor.
I just recommend really looking closely at oil and gas studies. They're the primary economic entity that has been actually disturbing seabed extracting for the history of the planet. They really have some good things, and some not so good things, but their experience base is the ones you really look at, actually. If you can't resolve it in their context, maybe it's not resolvable, actually. You gotta think about it differently. But very impressive stuff. And they will keep their proprietary data until they don't need it to be proprietary. It's all about bottom line. And if it's a tax break, it's no longer valuable to them in any way. So.
Anyone else? Tell us who you are.
Yes, I'm Jerry Miller, and since Craig tagged me as being a writer of some pieces of the ocean policy. I'd like to return to the subject that he was addressing at the time he made that remark.
And tell us where you work.
So I'm president of Science for Decisions, a consulting firm here in the DC area. But I was at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy for the last several years, during which the ocean policy was being developed. Craig was talking about critical environmental intelligence, and I'd like to talk a little bit about what I see as 4 flavors of critical intelligence, and get the panel to respond to these thoughts. And Dan, this will go partway towards your question of where you invest the $5. I think that on one end of the critical intelligence spectrum, there is pure exploratory research, pushing back the boundaries of darkness in geographic areas where we simply have so little information that we can't make judgments about what values may lie in that geographic domain. Secondly, there is basic research focused towards understanding processes by which things in the ocean are connected. So that developing that basic understanding, why do you want to do that? Because that will tell you what kind of data you need to collect if you want to continue to monitor those processes and the values that derive from them. Thirdly, there is what I think of as applied research, and it grows directly out of the basic research that I just talked about. Once you understand processes, you can then think more intelligently about what are the critical pieces of data that you need when and where in order to make good resource management decisions or good conservation decisions. And then fourthly, and a few years ago I probably wouldn't have added this 4th category, but as Dan so correctly pointed out earlier, we live now in changing times. The environment is changing, processes are being affected, those connections are being affected by extraction of resources, by climate change, and by just natural variability over time. So understanding the time varying critical bits of environmental intelligence is really important. So with that, I think you can have a filtering that helps you decide where to spend that $5. If you're concerned about fisheries, off the New England coast, then by working your way through those 4 steps of the creation of environmental intelligence, I think you can figure out where the best bang for your $5 really is. If it's in, the middle of the Pacific, deep abyssal plain, you're probably closer to the front end of that spectrum, but there's still value that I think we need to invest in discovery. So with that sort of as a backdrop, I'd love to hear the panel talk a little bit about how you would, or if you have an alternative construct for filtering how you prioritize your investments. I'd like to hear it.
Jane.
Just one view is that I'm not sure that it's really knowable. I mean, I think that going all the way back to the end of World War II and Vannevar Bush and this sort of the bargain that ONR in particular has been adept at, which is providing public money in exchange for what eventually will be public goods. It seems to me that the model that we have, which somebody mentioned was not top down, and I think that that's different from some other countries. The sort of bottom up proposals will help to solve that, because you'll get proposals that then are striking. I don't know if I'm not sure if you would want to go in and say, you have different accounts, but I'm not sure you'd want to go in and sort of prejudge, but rather take the best proposal that looks at the time. And so you can't make that judgment up front, is what I would suggest.
Jerry, I would go about this in a manner that looks at where we have already societally allocated resources. And if I look at what our spending is on coastal programs, then I got to ask myself, what is the next and most compelling incremental question in the coast? And I would compare that with breaking down your 4 process steps. what else do we need to know? And I would say that the pure exploratory research is probably the least funded currently in oceans. There are other aspects that we as a society choose to spend money on for pure exploration, and I mentioned those earlier. And I would look at where is the greatest potential of the bang for the buck, believing that we've already taken our first cut on where we should distribute those resources to work on. If I were spending zero on the coastal programs where most of this country's residents reside, I would certainly spend those $5 on the coast. But because we do spend more than $5 on the coasts, I'd be looking at where the hole is. And frankly, I think the hole is in deep sea discovery.
And did you hear the radio lab this weekend about deep sea exploration? No. Well, it was, I heard it in New Hampshire, but it was about this cruise from Woods Hole that went out to the Arctic to do some deep sea exploration. And they're trying to be strategic. You know, they said what they really wanted to find was the three-eyed tube worm, right? They really wanted to find something new. And the ROV went down and they lost it. You know. And then they sort of sent a second ROV down to kind of find the first ROV. And it turned out there were no three-eyed tube worms, but in the process of looking for the first ROV, they went over a crest and came down into this deep sea valley that was filled with deep sea yellow fluff of the type that they'd never ever seen. You know, so it was the serendipitous exploration that really made a difference. But you know, you think about sort of the value of exploration too. That the fifth element I would add to your construct is you gave a framework that is very rational, right? And sort of this is what would guide rational decisions. But there are many, many cases where we have all the information to make a good rational decision, and we still don't because we just hadn't been driven to take that next step. So you say, we're kind of here for the oceans. I don't think we're there for the deep sea. And so maybe you could say a little bit about the role of social psychology in thinking about data and science and exploration, because you've got to get something that takes all those first four steps and then puts them into action. We know, for instance, that big institutions are really slow, even when we have all the data. And a lot of times, the information that we respond to is called a subpoena, right? But there's still scientific information. So how, where you're working in sciences, for instance, how do you think about that psychological factor? And when we're thinking about that for the deep sea, what do we need sort of that will be revelatory?
So I can answer this very succinctly. When I say applied research to determine, which bits of information really is critical intelligence, for me that includes social sciences. That includes the interaction between the natural sciences and social sciences, because it's only critical intelligence if it really has meaning and value to somebody.
Yeah. In the social sciences, we're starting to do a better job of expanding the natural sciences into economics, but we're doing a lousy job of bringing in the environmental psychologist and the institutional psychologist and the social psychologist to really think about what motivates people.
Jerry, I like your scheme, very, very rational. I had like 3 steps, so look at my thing.
I used to have 3.
But there are 2 points I want to make. One is that you have to let chaos work. For us to think that we have the surgical, rational connections how we will direct things defeats us. So it's okay for things to be somewhat chaotic as long as you can converge them. So it really isn't that critical that you know your right exact balance between your categories for your $5. Because you got to look at it over time. Probably longer than your attention span, which is part of the problem. So you want to be converging things. Now, if we're talking about incentives, for the deep ocean, the incentives are only, I think, 1 or 2 kinds. One is that I can make a lot of money. So there's that basic incentive that drives companies, people, and things. Or there's another incentive that says, I'm working on a problem that is absolutely critical and relevant to me and/or relevant to the people that I care about. Because if I could figure out that, it relates this way to my life. And that's an education process. But in order to be able to make that connection for that kind of incentive, you need to have some facts of the case. You need to know something about those connections. We need to have enough representative examples of how the undiscovered led to the new discovery. And this is what it means, other than we have another nice piece of science, but it means this.
You know, there's three kinds of chaos. There's entropy, right? There's managed chaos, which is, I think, we're talking about decisions under uncertainty. And then there's harnessing chaos for innovation and invention. And so that is something that institutions don't think enough about either. So you know, if we're going to have a relatively chaotic deep sea for a while, what do we need to do to pull as much information out of that as possible?
So if I had the $5 and then you said, you're going to spend those $5 on deep sea stuff no matter what, well, I'm going to spend it by creating a lot of different incentives through a lot of different places to incentivize people that they're going to conclude on their own that there's some reason for me to do more, invest more, look more. So I'm not going to spend it on actually getting the data myself, like I could afford 10 more ship days. I'm not going to do that with it. I'm going to invest it in
giving you $20 a data.
Yes,
Right?
yes. Because I want to create that chaos. I want and converge it.
Yeah. I think Sally and Christine.
Well, you know, I was just going to say that, you know, in Dan's original construct, I mean, laws and focus and whatnot are driven by a felt need. You know, that's how we ended up with Magnuson Law, for example. There was suddenly all these foreign ships coming into the U.S. and so a number of lawmakers decided we were going to wall off the 200-mile zone. That said, there's still, in my opinion, if it's out of the realm of felt need, there is still responsibility of government to look beyond, you know, to appreciate the resource and focus on it. Maybe not all $5, but I think as the young lady over here discussed earlier, maybe it's $1 or $2 so that we are ahead and prepared for when we get to that time when technology or whatever determines, hey, we have a felt need out in that deep sea that we didn't realize, but now we're a little ahead of the curve, as you pointed out earlier.
And it's your job to invest for the future.
Yes.
Well, my husband, as a businessman, he often says, you need to diversify your portfolio. So theoretically, you would want to invest in all of those. And of course, I'm the one who says I want it all anyway. So you'd want to do everything in equal amounts. But in terms of at least an example of what the EU has been doing, and the one bit that I know of with respect to the deep sea projects, is they are funding under one umbrella both the basic research to understand the diversity and resilience of the species range. They still don't know the full life cycle of any one deep sea species, but they're close for some of these hydrothermal vent shrimp. So if you can fund a little bit more to understand where are they going and how far do they go and how do they reproduce, you've got a huge amount if you're starting to talk about eradicating an entire habitat in a more specific area. So as one part of a project that's directed towards a social goal of how do we mine in the most benign way possible, you have to have your basic research because we don't know anything out there. Maybe other types of projects you don't. But you also need to have the sort of your second tier, which are what are the scale of the impacts, the dynamics of the plumes, what's the toxicological interactions. When you slice open a hydrothermal vent, you get hydrogen sulfide interacting with the water, and it creates an even more reactive acid. So these things, you don't want to be surprised. You need to be able to understand that. And then you need to know your basic socioeconomic research, what's your market, who you're targeting. And you need your laws and policies, and your ability to create science-informed decisions. So there's no real way, in my mind, to knock off any one part of that decision tree.
And the real challenge, I think, in the deep sea, is that you make a decision and then suddenly, within 6 months, the science that you used is out of date. Right? And so your example of two methane vents, suddenly it's 200. What we thought was unique is now commonplace.
Yeah.
James?
Just a thought that it seems that the companies that want to access the resources ought to then capture the cost of those. I mean, to sort of throw it on government and say, you figure out how much I'm going to break this, doesn't seem right. It seems to me that the companies ought to have to come to the government and say, I'd like to do this, and then the government says, you haven't proven it yet that there's that the cost to everybody else that you've captured your externalities adequately, and maybe that means some sort of super fund or some other sort of idea if they're unknowable. But I just don't like the sense that the government's got to kind of rescue them and figure it out for them so they can go and.
Well, this is trying to get ahead of the curve because there are also requirements for the contractors to conduct environmental baseline studies, to do this sort of research themselves too, in their specific
Then
spots.
I would have them fund to get ahead of the curve. I'd say, you guys want to do this in 10 years? Well, you can fund it right now, and then that will accelerate it.
Yeah.
I would agree with that.
So
That's borne by us if we choose to take that risk.
So add to these large-scale surveys where you have to show that you are not destroying unique habitats.
Yeah.
You need to get out there and do the pilots.
Especially since there's, obviously there's limited money for everything, and so now that means that money that would have gone for that purpose isn't going to the National Institute of Health or some other, or some other need that doesn't have industry.
Where's the dollar?
Yeah, although, as Linda would say, there are some public goods that industry is not going to be able to look at. So with respect to the clearing Clipperton zone, each contractor has to look in their specific area and answer their questions with respect to individual impacts. But who is going to be looking at the cumulative impacts of the whole system? And I agree, make them pay, but it's not in their business model and not in the frame of how we're approaching things right now.
I mean, it's a good reason why there aren't any people doing this right now. I mean, I was there. I went through all this with companies, cost models, minerals markets. It's a good reason why no one has been doing this. And there are these minerals are also things that research may substitute for the product as well. So this is a hedging your bets, actually, in some sense. And if the bet could be hedged and get the government to finance stuff to hedge our bets, we're happy with that, as a company. Big companies. Lucky, that's their gig, actually.
Well, and the two parts of that mineral coin, one side is we talked about this last night, there's a heck of a lot of gold, nickel, and cadmium that's already out there that needs to be recycled.
Yeah.
That's the first. The second is that this demand for rare earth minerals is new. Could be short-lived, right? It could be copper, for instance, in wires, and so we really don't know what longevity that is.
We're on a technology wave, though. So Dan, it takes me back to your comment about how we're still waiting for the first element of production, even though there's a lot of activity in the area, a lot of government-funded activity by other countries, not the U.S. But the marvel that I see in front of us is the coincidence of many different technologies making significant advances. The notion of what engineering exists today that didn't exist at the time that Peter was speaking of when the original flurry of activity for manganese nodules may have come about. It's a very different world today, and the ocean industry is very different today, largely because of advances that oil has come forward with. So if we look at what is feasible today, many things are much more feasible, and if the price gets right economically, some of these minerals will be much more feasible. The engineering that's being used today is very different, but if we start looking at other questions that I want to make sure we don't forget about the deep sea, there is a significant amount of physical oceanography going on to figure out why the world is warm where it's warm. And it's because of where the heat is transported in the oceans. And again, I want to return to my original comment. It's not a two-dimensional ocean, it's a three-dimensional ocean. And something like the meridional overturning circulation studies, which have been going on for decades, and now just getting a little bit more ripe and part of people's cocktail conversations, it's very important that we don't understand this work. If we could team with industry who might have a need or a desire to go to a particular part of the ocean, totally independent of those kinds of studies, and piggyback our ability to study or make measurements in the area where people are working for other reasons. We have to get past the risk of proprietary information that's collaterally collected at that time, but at the same token, we could further lower our costs to get at those types of information that we really need. So again, for deep sea, it's not just harvesting and extracting material I can put in the palm of my hand. It's also knowledge that is very valuable for us at many different levels of management as well.
And to bring that all the way back around to where James started, deep sea restoration was costly and difficult. Now we haven't done it, right? And so all the technology that we can use to pick up manganese nodules and to harvest these polymetallic sulfides can be used to start restoring places that we know have value, dams connectivity, these deep sea corals and seamounts. So I'm more optimistic about our ability to begin restoring key parts of the deep sea. Maybe it's only 200 meters, maybe it's 1,000. But I'm also quite certain that if we're going to be serious about restoring fish stocks, we have to worry about the condition of the benthic ecosystem as well as the water color.